I collapsed mid-speech, blood pounding behind my eyes, and the hospital called my parents. They let it ring. 3 days later, I woke up to beeping machines and my family's para-selfie. No stress, no drama. Then Dad texted, "We need you. Tell me now, did they cross the line?" If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. I didn't faint. I didn't stumble. I didn't get overwhelmed. My body shut off like someone pulled the plug because pain had been screaming inside my skull for weeks and nobody wanted to hear it. 1 second I was gripping the podium. The next I was on the floor staring at stage lights that felt like knives, and the crowd of proud parents turned into a blur of mouths opening and closing without sound. And somewhere behind all that noise was the quietest truth of my life, waiting to surface. The hospital would later say brain tumor, but before that word ever existed, there was something far worse. There was absence. The kind that teaches you exactly where you stand. The EMTs were efficient, professional, fast, and when they asked who to call, someone grabbed my phone, scrolled, and did what you're supposed to do when a young woman collapses on the biggest day of her life. They called my parents. And then they called again. And again. And again. Straight to voicemail. No panic. No scrambling. No frantic rushing to the hospital. Just silence, clean and intentional, the kind of silence you only get from people who've practiced not showing up. And here's the part that still messes with my head. Somewhere deep down, even before I lost consciousness, I wasn't surprised. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even angry yet. I was embarrassed. Embarrassed that part of me had still expected them to come running like parents in movies do. Embarrassed that after a lifetime of being the dependable one, the quiet one, the one who handles things, I had still believed that collapsing publicly would finally earn concern. If you're watching this and your chest just tightened, stay with me because this story is not about illness. It's about what happens when love is conditional and you keep paying the price without ever reading the contract. Growing up, I was the backup plan child. Not the problem child, not the golden child, but the utility player. The one who fills gaps, absorbs stress, makes things easier so other people can shine. My sister Olivia was the celebration. I was the infrastructure. She got parties. I got responsibilities. She got reassurance. I got expectations. And the thing about that dynamic is it doesn't feel abusive when you're inside it. It feels normal. You tell yourself stories like "they need her more," or "I'm stronger," or my personal favorite lie, "this is just how families work." And then you build your entire identity around being low maintenance so you don't become a burden, and you don't realize you're disappearing until one day you literally drop in front of thousands of people and no one who shares your last name answers the phone. Weeks before graduation, the signs were already there. Migraines that felt like pressure building behind my left eye. Dizziness that made the room tilt when I stood up. Nosebleeds I laughed off as stress. Every symptom was explained away by the same chorus I'd heard my whole life. You're just tired. You overthink. You're dramatic. You push yourself too hard. And the thing is, when the people who raised you tell you your pain isn't real, your brain eventually agrees with them. You gaslight yourself for free. I was working 2 jobs, finishing my thesis, memorizing a speech meant to inspire others, all while my body was quietly begging for mercy. And where were my parents? Planning a destination celebration for Olivia. Dress fittings. Guest lists. Champagne tastings. My graduation was unfortunate timing. That phrase should be illegal. Unfortunate timing is rain on a picnic. It's not choosing Paris over your child's milestone. And before you think, well, maybe they didn't know how bad it was, let me stop you right there. They knew I was struggling. They just didn't think it mattered enough to interrupt their plans. That's the difference. Intent isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just priority. Midway through all this chaos, I need to know something, because I don't want to feel like I'm talking into a void. Where are you watching from right now? Country, city, even just your couch at 2 a.m., drop it in the comments, because stories like this hit differently depending on where you are in your own life. And I promise you, I read those comments, especially the ones that start with "this happened to me too." The night before graduation, I couldn't sleep. My head felt like it was being squeezed from the inside. I stared at the ceiling and thought about how weird it was that the people who taught me to tie my shoes couldn't tell you what I was scared of, what I wanted, or what it took for me to survive. The morning of the ceremony, my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. Just landed. Have a great day. So proud. Attached was a smiling airport selfie. Sunglasses. Luggage. Freedom. I remember thinking, wow, even their guilt texts are efficient. And then I stepped onto that stage, smiled because that's what you do when you've been trained to perform, and everything went dark. When I woke up days later, tubes in my arms and machines breathing for me, the first face I saw wasn't my mother's. It wasn't my father's. It was my grandfather's. Wrinkled hands, red eyes, suit still pressed like he'd never left the ceremony. He had shown up. He always did. And sitting beside him was my best friend, exhausted, furious, loyal. That's when the doctor explained what they found, how close it was, how lucky I was, and how they needed consent fast. Consent my parents never gave, because they never answered. My grandfather signed. He chose me. And that choice would eventually expose everything my parents had been hiding, including why they suddenly started calling nonstop days later, not to ask how I was, not to apologize, but because they were afraid of losing something they never earned. And that's where this really begins, because what came next wasn't about survival anymore. It was about reckoning. And if you think the betrayal peaked when they skipped my graduation, you're not ready for what they try to take from me next. When I finally had enough strength to sit up on my own, that's when the calls started coming in waves, not soft concerned waves, but frantic, aggressive ones, the kind that vibrate your phone off the hospital tray like someone on the other end is pounding a locked door they suddenly realize they need open. 65 missed calls. Not spread over days. Over hours. From my father mostly, a few from my mother, one from Olivia that just said, "Call us now." "No, how are you feeling?" "No, we're so sorry." Just urgency without care, like I was a malfunctioning asset instead of a person who just had her skull opened. I remember staring at the screen and feeling something strange, not sadness, not rage yet, but clarity, sharp and cold. This wasn't concern. This was panic. And panic only comes when someone realizes they're about to lose control. I asked my grandfather why now. Why after days of silence did they suddenly remember I existed? And he didn't answer right away. He just sat there, hands folded, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the wall like he was bracing himself for a storm he'd been avoiding for decades. And then he said the sentence that changed how I saw my entire childhood. "Because they think you might find out." "Find out what?" I asked, already feeling my stomach drop, because when someone who loves you hesitates like that, you know the truth is about to hurt in a new way. He told me about the account. The one my grandmother set up before I was even born. Not a college fund. Not something meant to be managed by my parents, but a graduation gift. Money meant to give me options, independence, an exit if I ever needed one. She called it my Freedom Fund. Hearing that name felt like someone reached across time and touched my shoulder. Freedom. The thing I never felt allowed to want. My grandfather explained how he'd written 2 checks years ago, one for me, one for Olivia, trusting my parents to do the right thing. Olivia's went to her tuition. Mine vanished. Spent. Absorbed. Justified. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because suddenly we can't afford that. Every dismissal, every sacrifice I made while telling myself it was noble clicked into place like a rigged game finally exposed. Trust, I realized, is a contract you don't know you're signing until someone breaks it. And my parents had been breaking it quietly for years while smiling in family photos. That's when it hit me. The collapse wasn't just my body failing. It was the structure I'd been living inside finally giving way. When they showed up the next day, my mother swept into the room with practiced concern, my father trailing behind like a man hoping no one would ask him questions he couldn't answer, Olivia standing awkwardly near the door, already annoyed at the inconvenience. They talked at me, not to me. How scared they were. How hard the flight back was. How dramatic everything had become. And I watched them carefully, the way you do when you finally understand you're dealing with people who don't see you as fully real. My mother tried to hug me. I didn't hug back. The room shifted. You could feel it. My father cleared his throat and said my name the way you do when you want to reset the tone without addressing the problem. I asked one question. Just one. Why didn't you answer the phone? Silence. Not confusion. Not surprise. Silence. And that silence told me everything. My mother said something about flights and time zones. My father stared at the floor. Olivia rolled her eyes like this was all excessive. And that's when I realized something else that's important if you're watching this and questioning your own family dynamics. Betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just everyone agreeing not to look directly at the truth. I told them about the account, about the money, about what Grandpa had told me. My mother's face went pale, then defensive, then angry in rapid succession, like watching a mask crack and reform. She said it was family money, that everything they did was for the family. I asked her why family only seemed to flow in one direction. My father finally spoke then, said I was being unfair, that I didn't understand the pressure they were under, that Olivia needed support, that I was strong and independent and didn't need the same things. That word again. Independent. The compliment they use when they mean expendable. I told them something I'd never said out loud before. That being strong isn't the same as being unbreakable, and being quiet doesn't mean being okay. Olivia scoffed and said I was overreacting, that nearly dying didn't give me the right to rewrite the family story. That's when my grandfather stood up, and I'd never heard his voice sound like that, calm but lethal, the tone of a man who has decided he's done being polite. He told them exactly what he thought, not as a father or a grandfather, but as a witness who'd watched favoritism rot a family from the inside. He told them they didn't lose me on that stage. They lost me long before, when they taught me that love was something I had to earn by disappearing. My mother cried then, real tears this time, but not the kind that repair anything. The kind that come when someone realizes the version of themselves they've been protecting won't survive exposure. They left soon after. Not resolved. Not healed. Just confronted. And when the door closed, the room felt lighter, not because the pain was gone, but because the lie was. Recovery gave me time. Too much time. Time to replay moments I'd minimized. Time to see patterns I'd excused. Time to understand that people-pleasing is just survival training that overstays its welcome. I thought about how many times I'd apologized for needing things. How often I'd swallowed anger because I didn't want to be difficult. And I wondered how many people watching this right now are doing the same thing, calling it loyalty, when it's actually fear of abandonment. Here's the thing no one tells you. When you stop accepting scraps, the people who benefited from you being hungry get angry. That anger doesn't mean you're wrong. It means the system changed. The calls slowed after that. The tone shifted. Less demanding. More cautious. My father started calling once a week. Awkward questions, small efforts. My mother sent messages that felt like they were written by someone trying not to step on glass. Olivia disappeared entirely. Blocked me everywhere. And you know what surprised me the most? I felt relief. Grief too, yes, but relief was louder. Because I wasn't performing anymore. I was just existing. I used part of the money my grandmother left me to get my own place, small, imperfect mine. And standing in that empty apartment, I realized something that still makes my chest tighten when I say it. Safety isn't about who shares your blood. It's about who shows up when you can't stand on your own. And the scariest part wasn't losing my parents. It was realizing I'd never really had them the way I needed. If you're still here, ask yourself something honestly. If you collapse tomorrow, who would answer the phone? And if the answer scares you, stay with me, because what happened next forced me to decide whether reconciliation was even possible, and the choice I made didn't just change my relationship with my family, it changed how I see love itself. After they left that hospital room and the door clicked shut behind them, something strange happened that no one warns you about when you finally stop begging for love from people who ration it like punishment. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt clean. For the first time in my life, no one was disappointed in me in that moment. No one was asking me to fix something, smooth something over, apologize for existing too loudly or needing too much. It was just me, the steady beep of machines, my grandfather's breathing in the chair beside me, and a truth that refused to be folded back into a lie. And then the guilt came because of course it did. Guilt is the aftershock of every boundary you weren't raised to have. I remember thinking, maybe I was too harsh. Maybe I should have waited. Maybe nearly dying had made me dramatic. That's how deep conditioning goes. You can be cut open and still worry about hurting the people who held the knife. Over the next few days, doctors came and went. Nurses joked with me. Rachel sat by my bed telling me stories about work gossip and half-burned dinners like nothing monumental had happened. And in those normal moments, I started to understand something terrifying and liberating at the same time. Life goes on whether your parents approve of you or not. The world didn't collapse because they weren't there. It kept moving, and I was still in it. When I was discharged, the hospital doors sliding open felt like a threshold, not just back into the world, but into a version of myself that wasn't constantly negotiating for permission to exist. Grandpa drove me to my new apartment, the one I'd signed for quietly while I was still in recovery, and as we pulled up he squeezed the steering wheel and said, "Your grandmother would have loved this, not because it was fancy, but because it was yours." That sentence landed harder than any lecture ever could. Ownership. Choice. Agency. Words that were never used around me growing up unless they were being taken away. The first night there, I slept on a mattress on the floor and still felt richer than I ever had. No one could barge in. No one could assign me tasks. No one could measure my worth against someone else's shine. But here's the part people don't show you in empowerment montages. The grief doesn't disappear just because you stop being mistreated. It actually gets louder at first because now you're not numbing it with hope. I grieved the parents I thought I had, the ones I defended in conversations, the ones I believed would show up if it really mattered. I grieved the childhood where I learned to be convenient instead of cherished. And I grieved the version of myself who thought endurance was the same thing as love. My father started calling weekly like he promised, stiff conversations at first, asking what I ate, how my recovery was going, saying my name like he was testing how it sounded without frustration attached. I could hear him trying, and that made it complicated, because effort from someone who failed you doesn't erase the damage, but it also doesn't mean nothing. My mother sent cards, careful language, no demands, no guilt trips, which told me she was finally scared of losing access instead of assuming it. Olivia stayed silent, and if I'm honest, that hurt less than I expected. When someone's always been the loudest voice in the room, their absence can feel like peace masquerading as loss. Weeks passed, then months. I started teaching, standing in front of kids who didn't know my family history, didn't know my collapse, didn't know the price I'd paid to learn how to speak up. They just saw me. And every time one of them raised a hand nervously, or apologized before asking a question, or tried to shrink themselves to avoid attention, something in my chest tightened, because I recognized it immediately. That reflex doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from environments where love is conditional and mistakes are tallied. One afternoon, after the last bell rang and the room emptied, a student lingered and asked me quietly if it was okay to want more than what your family expects from you. I remember sitting down in that chair and realizing how far I'd come, because instead of flinching at the question, I smiled and said yes, without hesitation. That night, I got a message from Olivia. Just one line. Can we talk? No apology. No context. Just an opening move. And I stared at it longer than I want to admit, because here's where things get messy. When the golden child falls, everyone expects the scapegoat to catch them. That's how the system survives. I thought about everything she'd said, everything she'd taken for granted, the way my pain had been background noise to her celebration. And then I thought about who I wanted to be now, not who they trained me to be. I told her I could talk, but not to fix anything, not to lend money, not to absorb blame. Just to talk, she called. Her voice sounded smaller, stripped of entitlement, and for the first time I heard fear instead of superiority. She talked about her engagement falling apart, about friends disappearing, about realizing that admiration isn't the same as loyalty. And here's where I'll ask you something, because I want you involved in this, not just watching it. Where are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? Because moments like this hit differently depending on whether it's midnight and quiet or broad daylight and loud, and I want to know which version of you this is landing on. Olivia cried. Not pretty cries. Panicked ones. She asked me what to do. And for a split second, muscle memory kicked in, that old urge to step in, to rescue, to prove my worth through usefulness. But I didn't. I told her the truth, that I couldn't be her safety net the way she'd never been mine, that I could listen, but not carry her. She went quiet, then said something that surprised me. I never realized how much you did for everyone. That's the thing about invisible labor. People only notice it when it stops. We didn't reconcile that night. We didn't blow up either. It was unfinished, and for once I was okay with that. Because closure isn't something you get from other people. It's something you decide you don't need anymore. My mother tried next, asking if we could have coffee, just the two of us. I agreed, with rules. Public place. 1 hour. No rewriting history. She arrived nervous, older somehow, like someone who'd aged a decade under the weight of consequences. She talked about her childhood, about feeling judged, about never being enough, about seeing my grandmother's face in mine, and feeling exposed all over again. And here's where the rage bait part comes in, because if you're listening to this and thinking, that explains it, let me stop you. Explanation is not absolution. Trauma doesn't give you a license to traumatize someone else. I told her that. Calmly. Clearly. That her pain was real, and so was mine, and that one didn't cancel the other out. She cried again. Apologized. And for the first time, didn't ask me to comfort her through it. That mattered. My father showed change in quieter ways. Consistency. Showing up when it wasn't convenient. Asking questions and sitting with answers that made him uncomfortable. And slowly, painfully, I learned the difference between reconciliation and access. You can allow someone back into your life without handing them the keys. If you've ever been taught that family loyalty means endless forgiveness without accountability, let me say this plainly. That's not loyalty. That's self-erasure. Loyalty that costs you your health, your voice, your safety is not a virtue. It's a warning sign. As my life expanded, there's adjusted around the fact that I was no longer orbiting them. And that adjustment was the real test. Some passed parts of it. Some didn't. And that's okay. Because the biggest shift wasn't in them. It was in me. I stopped auditioning. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped translating my needs into something more palatable. And here's the part that might make you angry in a good way. Nothing bad happened because of it. The world didn't end. The family didn't implode because I set boundaries. What imploded was the illusion that my silence was holding everything together. If you're watching this and feeling that tightness in your chest, that recognition that maybe you've been the glue to, ask yourself this. What would happen if you stopped holding it all up? Who would show up? Who would disappear? And what would that tell you? Because the next chapter of the story forced me to answer that question in a way I didn't expect. When a letter from the past landed in my hands and revealed that the person who saw me most clearly had been gone my entire life, and yet somehow still knew exactly who I was becoming, and that revelation changed how I understood love, legacy, and the kind of family you're allowed to build when the one you're born into fails you. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which feels important because nothing life-changing ever seems to happen on days that announce themselves. It's always the ordinary ones that slip a blade between your ribs while you're making coffee and pretending everything is fine. Grandpa brought it over in a plain envelope, yellowed at the edges, my name written in careful cursive that didn't match his handwriting, and the moment I saw it, my chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with my surgery scars and everything to do with grief I hadn't allowed myself to feel yet. He didn't sit down right away, just stood there holding it like it might explode, and said, "Your grandmother wrote this before she died. She told me to give it to you when you graduated, not if, when," and then he added quietly, "She always knew things like that," and then he finally handed it to me like he was placing something sacred into my hands. I didn't open it immediately, and that's another thing people don't talk about, how sometimes you're afraid of answers even when you've spent your whole life starving for them, because answers remove the fantasy that maybe one day things would magically make sense. I made tea. Ridiculous, I know, like boiling water could somehow prepare me for the weight of words written by someone who had been gone longer than I'd been alive, and Grandpa watched me with that soft patience that never demanded I perform or react on schedule. When I finally opened it, the paper crackled like it was waking up from a long sleep, and the first line stole the air from my lungs because it started with my full name, not the nickname everyone else used, not the shortened version that felt easier to dismiss, but my full name, the one that felt like it belonged to a whole person. She wrote about watching me as a baby, about the way I stared at people like I was cataloging the world instead of being afraid of it, about how she worried that my sensitivity would be mistaken for weakness by people who didn't know how to protect it. And then she wrote something that made my hand shake. She said, if you ever feel like you're too much or not enough at the same time, that's because you're in a room where love is conditional, and you need to leave that room, even if it's called family. Let that sink in for a second, because this woman died before I could speak, and she somehow named the trap I wouldn't realize I was in until I nearly lost my life, trying to earn affection that was never meant to be transactional. She wrote about money too, but not the way my parents talk about it, not as leverage or proof of superiority. She wrote about it as freedom, as a way to never have to beg for kindness or stay where you're not safe because you can't afford to leave. She said, I'm giving you this not because you owe me success, but because I want you to have choices, and if anyone ever makes you feel guilty for using them, remember that guilt is the favorite tool of people who benefit from your fear. I was crying so hard by the time I finished that Grandpa had to put a hand on my back just to remind me I was still here, still breathing, and then he said something that shifted the ground again. He said your father was always jealous of her certainty, of the way she saw through people, and that jealousy curdled into resentment after she died because there was no one left to challenge him. Suddenly pieces clicked into place, not excuses, explanations, but patterns. The way my mother flinched when Grandma's name came up, the way my father avoided conversations that required accountability, the way Olivia was propped up as proof that everything was fine while I was used as the engine that kept it all running quietly in the background. If trust is a contract, mine had been breached repeatedly, and I'd been gaslit into believing I was imagining the fine print changing. That night after Grandpa left, I couldn't sleep, so I sat on the floor with that letter and thought about all the moments I'd swallowed anger because it felt ungrateful, all the times I'd minimized my pain because someone else had it worse, all the times I'd mistaken endurance for love. And then my phone buzzed because of course it did, and it was my mother asking if we could talk again. She said she'd been thinking a lot, which is parent speak for I'm uncomfortable and I want relief, not necessarily resolution. I didn't answer right away, and that's when it hit me. The power of the pause, the fact that I no longer had to respond on demand to prove I was good, agreeable, worthy. When we did talk later, I told her about the letter, about how her mother-in-law had seen what she herself refused to look at, and instead of lashing out, she went quiet, and in that silence, I could hear something breaking that wasn't me. She admitted she'd always felt like an outsider in that family, like she was being evaluated and found lacking, and instead of processing that, she'd redirected it onto the one person who couldn't fight back, the child who looked like the judge. She never escaped. And this is where I want to pull you in again, because I need you thinking about your own life right now. Have you ever been punished for reminding someone of a version of themselves they didn't want to face? Have you ever been turned into a mirror and then blamed for the reflection? I told her I understood her pain, and then I told her very clearly that understanding didn't mean accepting the damage, that forgiveness without change was just permission for it to continue. And if she wanted a relationship with me, it would have to be built from scratch, not patched together with apologies that evaporated under pressure. She agreed to therapy, real therapy, not the kind you quit when it starts asking inconvenient questions. And for the first time I believed she might actually do it, not because she suddenly became a hero, but because consequences had finally reached her. Olivia didn't take it as well. When she found out about the letter and the money and the boundaries, she accused me of rewriting the family narrative, of playing the victim, of tearing everyone apart for attention, which is rich coming from someone whose entire identity had been constructed around being centered. She said family sticks together no matter what, and I asked her calmly where that loyalty had been when I was on an operating table, and she didn't have an answer that didn't sound like avoidance dressed up as principle. That conversation ended with her hanging up, and I won't lie, it hurt, but it also clarified something crucial. Some people don't want healing, they want hierarchy restored. Around this time, my students started a unit on personal narratives, and one kid asked if you can change the ending of your story, and without thinking I said you can't change what happened, but you can absolutely change who gets to define it, and the room went quiet because kids know when you're not just teaching content, you're teaching survival. Outside of school, life kept unfolding, small joys stacking up. Dinners with Rachel, where we laughed about things that would have destroyed me a year earlier. Sunday breakfasts with Grandpa, where he told stories about Grandma that felt like gifts instead of ghosts. Quiet evenings where I realized my nervous system wasn't constantly bracing for impact anymore. And then, just when things felt almost steady, my father showed up at my door unannounced, not with demands, not with guilt, but with a box of old photographs and a look I'd never seen on his face before, fear that he might actually lose me. He admitted things he'd never said out loud, that it was easier to let my mother direct her resentment toward me than to confront it, that he told himself I was resilient, so he wouldn't have to feel complicit, that he chose peace over justice, and called it pragmatism. I didn't absolve him, but I acknowledged the honesty, because growth doesn't always look like redemption arcs. Sometimes it looks like people sitting in the wreckage of their choices without asking you to clean it up. We talked about Grandma, about the money, about how he'd used what was meant for my future to maintain an image, and I watched him realize in real time that control masquerading as care always comes with a bill due eventually. If you're still here with me, I want you to ask yourself something uncomfortable. If the people who hurt you finally admitted it, would you even want what they're offering now? Or are you only chasing the apology because it feels like proof that the pain was real? Because here's the twist I didn't expect. The more my family scrambled to redefine our relationships, the less I needed their validation to feel whole, and that's when the power dynamics truly shifted. They weren't the arbiters of my worth anymore. They were applicants for access to my life, and that terrified them. But the real reckoning wasn't finished yet, because the last piece of this puzzle came from a place I wasn't looking at all, a truth about my collapse, my body, and the years of stress I normalized that reframed everything as not just emotional betrayal, but a physical one. And when that realization hit, it forced a confrontation that none of us could dodge, one that would decide whether this family could evolve or fracture for good. And that moment came with a diagnosis that went far beyond the tumor they removed and straight into the damage caused by living in constant fight or flight for most of my life. The neurologist didn't say it dramatically. There was no pause for effect, no music swelling in the background like in movies. She just looked at my chart and said something that rewired my understanding of my entire life in one sentence. She said what you experienced wasn't just a tumor. It was a nervous system that had been living under sustained threat for years, and your body finally pulled the emergency brake. And I remember staring at her thinking that sounded poetic, but wrong, because I wasn't in danger. I was just busy, stressed, responsible, the words people use when they don't want to admit they're drowning. And then she started explaining how chronic emotional neglect, hypervigilance, and people-pleasing don't just hurt feelings, they train your body to live like it's under attack even when nothing is happening, cortisol staying high, inflammation never fully shutting off, sleep never actually restorative. And suddenly my collapse on stage didn't feel random anymore. It felt inevitable, like my body had been filing complaints for years and finally went on strike. She asked about my childhood, about responsibility, about whether I felt like I had to earn rest, earn love, earn safety, and I laughed at first because the answer felt obvious. And then I realized how messed up that was. That earning rest had felt normal to me. She said something else that stuck like a splinter. She said people don't break because they're weak, they break because they were strong for too long without relief. And I thought about every holiday I managed, every crisis I absorbed, every time I swallowed disappointment so the room wouldn't feel awkward. And I wondered how many other people watching this right now feel their chest tighten because they recognize that pattern in themselves. When I told my parents what the doctor said, not the tumor part, they'd already processed that, but the part about stress and neglect and long-term damage. My mother went quiet in that way she does when she's cornered by truth, and my father stared at the floor like it might open up and swallow him, because suddenly this wasn't about intention anymore. It was about impact, measurable, documented, undeniable impact. And you can't gaslight an MRI. My mother tried to soften it, said everyone has stress, said I was always sensitive, said she never meant for me to carry so much, and I stopped her gently but firmly and said intention doesn't heal damage, accountability does. And that was the first time I saw fear cross her face, real fear, because she realized this wasn't a conversation she could cry her way out of. Olivia, on the other hand, reacted exactly how entitlement reacts when it's threatened. She scoffed, said plenty of people grow up with worse, said I was exaggerating because I finally had money and attention, and that's when something in me snapped cleanly instead of shattering, because for the first time I didn't feel the urge to explain myself to her, to translate my pain into language she could digest. I just said, you don't get to decide what hurts me, and if minimizing my pain is how you protect your self-image, then you're choosing distance, not me. She laughed, but it was brittle, the kind of laugh people make when they feel the ground shifting and don't know where to stand anymore. This is the part where a lot of people expect revenge, fireworks, dramatic ultimatums, but the real power move wasn't loud, it was structural. I changed how access worked. I stopped updating them automatically, stopped filling silence, stopped volunteering emotional labor, and you'd be shocked how quickly people panic when they realize they don't actually know how to reach you without using guilt as a crowbar. My father called more at first, awkward check-ins, questions he should have asked years ago, and I could tell he was trying, not perfectly, not smoothly, but genuinely, and I let him, cautiously, because repair doesn't require forgetting, it requires consistency. My mother started therapy and hated it, which is usually a sign it's working because growth feels like an insult when you've built your identity around being right, and she'd call me after sessions sometimes sounding raw and defensive and confused, saying things like I didn't realize how much I resented her until now, and I'd tell her calmly that realization was her responsibility, not my burden, and then I'd hang up before the conversation slid into emotional quicksand. Grandpa watched all of this with a quiet steadiness that reminded me healing doesn't have to be loud to be profound, and one night over dinner, he said something that reframed the entire situation. He said families don't fall apart when someone speaks the truth. They fall apart when they depend on silence to function, and that sentence should honestly be stitched onto pillows and handed out at holidays. Around this time, my students started asking deeper questions, not about literature but about life, about fairness, about why some people get support and others don't, and I realized I was teaching from a place of lived clarity now, not theory, and there's a difference kids can feel, because when you've survived something and integrated it, your words carry weight without force. And here's where the tension tightens again, because just when it seemed like the dust was settling, an email arrived that dragged the past back into the present. One that revealed how deep the financial betrayal actually went. Not just negligence, not just favoritism, but a decision that had shaped my entire trajectory without my consent. And when I opened it, I understood that the collapse on that stage wasn't the beginning of this story breaking open. It was the midpoint, the moment the lie could no longer hold. And what I found next would force a confrontation that even I wasn't prepared for. One that would test whether accountability in this family was possible or if distance would become permanent. And that reckoning didn't start with shouting. It started with numbers on a screen that told a story no one could talk their way out of. The numbers on that screen didn't shout at me. They didn't accuse. They just sat there quietly, which somehow made them louder than any argument we'd ever had. Line items dated back years. Transfers that lined up too neatly with moments I remembered being told no. Moments when I'd been encouraged to take extra shifts, apply for just one more scholarship, be patient, be grateful, be understanding. And I remember my hands going cold as my brain started connecting dots it had been trained not to. See, because when you grow up being told resources are scarce, you don't question where they go. You just assume they were never meant for you. I called Grandpa first because he was the only one who had never lied to me about capacity, and when I told him what I'd found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Not shocked silence, but tired silence, the kind that says I was afraid you'd find out this way. And then he said softly, they thought if you never knew, it wouldn't count as stealing, and that sentence rewired something fundamental in me. Because suddenly the narrative wasn't favoritism or neglect anymore, it was entitlement paired with rationalization, and that's a much uglier beast. When I confronted my parents, I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't raise my voice even once, because clarity has a weight that emotion can't carry, and I laid the papers out on the table like evidence, dates, amounts, correlations, and I watched my father's face collapse inward as he realized denial wasn't going to save him this time. My mother tried first, she always did, tried to contextualize, to explain how money moves around, how parenting is complicated, how intentions matter, and I stopped her again and said something that felt like stepping off a ledge without knowing if there was ground below. I said, you made decisions about my future without my consent and benefited from my silence, and that's not parenting. That's exploitation. Olivia laughed, Of course she did, called it dramatic, said I was twisting things, said everyone contributes differently to families, and that's when I looked at her and realized she had never questioned the flow of support because it had always flowed toward her, and people rarely interrogate systems that benefit them. I asked her a simple question: did you ever wonder why I worked so much while you didn't have to? And she opened her mouth and closed it again, because the truth had never required curiosity from her before. My father finally spoke then, voice cracking in a way I'd never heard, admitted that it started small, borrowing, reallocating, telling himself he'd fix it later, and later just kept getting pushed down the road because no one was forcing him to stop, because I wasn't making noise. And that's when I realized something crucial that I want you listening to really closely if you're watching this and feeling that familiar ache in your chest. Silence doesn't protect peace, it protects the people who benefit from things staying exactly as they are. I told them I wasn't asking for repayment in the way they expected, not checks, not apologies dressed up as solutions, but structural change, boundaries that didn't rely on my endurance to hold them together, and they looked confused because they were used to problems being solved by me absorbing the cost. I said I was taking control of my finances entirely, that there would be no more shared access, no more assumptions, no more emotional leverage disguised as family obligation, and my mother cried then, real tears, but they weren't about me. They were about losing control of the narrative, about facing a version of herself she'd spent decades avoiding. And in the middle of all of this, something unexpected happened. My body responded, the headaches eased, my sleep deepened, the constant low-grade tension I'd lived with like background noise started to quiet, because safety isn't just physical, it's relational, and my nervous system finally realized I wasn't going to keep volunteering myself for harm. At work, I started saying no without explanation. At home, I stopped preemptively managing other people's feelings, and every time I chose myself without apologizing for it, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for the version of me who didn't know she was allowed to do this sooner, and relief that she didn't have to keep going like that anymore. Grandpa told me once during this period that growth often feels like betrayal to people who benefited from your stagnation, and that sentence landed so hard I had to write it down, because it explained the backlash, the guilt-tripping, the sudden emergencies that only I could fix, the narrative shifts that painted me as cold, changed, ungrateful, and I understood then that this was the cost of not returning to the role they'd assigned me. If you're watching this right now and you've ever been told you're different after setting boundaries, ask yourself, different from what? Different from silent, different from useful, different from convenient, and tell me where you're watching from, because I want to know how far the story is traveling and how many people recognize themselves in it. The tension didn't explode all at once. It tightened slowly like a wire being pulled, because what comes next wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a revelation that forced a choice I couldn't undo. A choice between maintaining a version of family that required my disappearance or stepping fully into a life that didn't ask me to shrink to be loved. And that choice would be tested in a way I didn't see coming. Not by anger, but by vulnerability, when the person who had benefited the most from the imbalance finally showed up at my door asking for something she'd never needed before, and that moment would determine whether the story turned toward repair or permanent distance. And I need you with me for what happens next, because it's where the illusion finally breaks. I'm continuing exactly where we left off. Same breath, same spine. No reset, no soft landing, because what walked through my door that night wasn't just Olivia. It was the unspoken debt of an entire family wearing her face. And the first thing I noticed wasn't anger or entitlement, but fear. Real fear. The kind you only see when the safety net you never acknowledge suddenly rips. And she stood there twisting her fingers like a stranger. Not the golden child, not the one with the cushion, just a woman who had finally run out of forward momentum. She didn't ask how I was, she didn't reference the surgery or the numbers or the history. She went straight to the point because urgency strips people of pretense. She said she needed help, and then she stopped talking as if waiting for the old reflex to kick in. The one where I filled the silence with solutions, and when I didn't, when I just looked at her and waited, something in her cracked open in a way I hadn't seen before. She told me the engagement was unraveling, that the money she assumed would always be there wasn't, that the life she planned was built on promises she never checked because she never had to, and I realized in that moment that we had been raised in the same house but trained in completely different survival strategies, mine built around endurance, hers around expectation. I asked her a question that felt dangerous even as it left my mouth. I asked what she thought would happen if I said no, and she laughed at first, a short, brittle sound. Then she stopped because she realized she didn't know the answer, because the version of me who said no had never existed in her world before. I told her I couldn't fix this for her, not financially, not emotionally, not structurally, and I watched her cycle through disbelief, anger, bargaining, and finally something like understanding, because this wasn't about punishment. It was about refusing to continue a pattern that required one of us to stay small so the other could stay comfortable. She accused me of changing, of becoming cold, of letting Grandpa turn me against them, and I told her the truth without raising my voice. I told her that clarity looks like cruelty to people who benefit from confusion, and that sentence hung between us like a mirror she wasn't ready to look into. When she left, she didn't slam the door, she didn't cry, she just walked away slower than she arrived, and I knew that whatever happened next would define whether this family could ever recalibrate or whether this was the moment the axis finally shifted beyond repair. The fallout came quietly at first: canceled plans, awkward texts, third-party messages trying to broker peace without addressing the fracture, and then it came louder. Accusations framed as concern, concern framed as love, love framed as obligation, and I stayed still through all of it, because stillness is the hardest boundary to breach when people are used to you reacting. Grandpa checked in daily, not to advise, not to fix, just to witness, and that mattered more than anything because being seen without being steered is a rare kind of support. He told me something during one of those calls that I want you to hold on to if this story is stirring something uncomfortable in you. He said families don't fracture when truth is spoken. They fracture when truth is delayed so long it becomes explosive, and that reframed everything I'd been taught about keeping the peace. My parents eventually asked for a meeting, neutral ground, careful language, and I agreed, not because I owed them but because I needed to hear what they would say without the leverage of urgency, and what they said confirmed what I already knew. They wanted restoration without reckoning, closeness without accountability, access without adjustment. And I told them calmly that reconciliation without repair is just a request to resume harm with better manners. My mother cried again. My father apologized again. But apologies without behavioral change are just maintenance tools, and I wasn't interested in preserving a system that required my disappearance to function. I left that meeting lighter than I arrived, not because it went well, but because I didn't abandon myself to make it survivable, and that's a quiet kind of victory no one applauds, but you feel it in your bones. If you've ever been in a room where everyone wants resolution but no one wants responsibility, you know exactly what I mean, and you also know that the real test isn't whether people say the right words, it's whether they can tolerate the discomfort of your boundaries without trying to negotiate them away. What happens next isn't explosive or cinematic. It's subtler and more revealing, because the final turn in the story isn't about money or betrayal or even forgiveness. It's about what happens when someone who is never supposed to choose herself actually does, and the world around her has to rearrange or walk away. And the next moment will show you exactly who stays when you stop making it easy for them to leave. What finally settled everything wasn't a confrontation or a speech or some cinematic victory moment. It was the slow, almost boring process of me continuing to live well without asking permission, because that's the part no one prepares you for when you stop being the emotional utility player in your family, the silence afterward, the recalibration. The way people keep checking to see if this new version of you is permanent or just a phase they can wait out, and I could feel it in the way my phone stayed quiet for days at a time, in the way conversations shifted from demands to observations, in the way my name stopped being followed by instructions and started being followed by pauses. I moved forward anyway, not loudly, not defiantly, just forward, back into my routines, my work, my friendships, my body healing, my mind unlearning patterns it thought were love but were really just endurance drills. And something strange happened in that quiet stretch. I started noticing how many decisions I'd been postponing my entire life because I was waiting for approval that was never coming. I changed small things first: the way my apartment looked, the way my mornings felt, the way I spoke about myself out loud, and then bigger things: the projects I said yes to, the people I no longer over-explained myself to, the boundaries I stopped justifying. And every time I did, the world didn't collapse the way I'd been warned it would. It adjusted, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes resentfully, sometimes beautifully. My sister tried one more time weeks later, softer this time, not asking for money or solutions but for proximity, and I met her where she was without stepping backward. I told her I wasn't interested in recreating the old dynamic with nicer language, that closeness required effort from both sides, not nostalgia, and that if she wanted a relationship it would have to be built from curiosity instead of entitlement. And she didn't like hearing that, but she stayed, which told me more than any apology ever could. My parents took longer, much longer, because systems resist change hardest at the top, and I watched them cycle through grief, anger, self-pity, partial insight, and finally something resembling acceptance, not because they suddenly understood everything, but because the old levers stopped working, and when manipulation loses its effect, people are forced to choose between growth and isolation. Grandpa remained the constant, not as a hero or savior, but as proof that family doesn't have to be complicated to be deep, that showing up consistently is more powerful than any dramatic gesture. And one afternoon while we were sitting together, he said something that I think about almost daily now. He said some families don't raise children, they raise roles, and the tragedy isn't that the roles are unfair, it's that no one teaches you how to leave them. That hit harder than anything else because I realized how many people watching this right now are still trapped in parts they never auditioned for: the fixer, the peacemaker, the strong one, the invisible one, the one who doesn't need anything. And if that's you, I want you to hear this clearly. Needing less doesn't mean you deserve less. It just means you adapted faster. The real payoff didn't come in the form of apologies or reconciliations or even justice. It came in the way my nervous system finally learned what safety felt like without performance, the way joy stopped feeling borrowed, the way rest stopped feeling earned, and the way I could sit alone without feeling like I was failing someone by doing so. I started talking openly about what happened, not to shame my family but to free myself, and the number of messages I received from people saying this felt like my life, this felt like my childhood, this felt like the moment I realized I was loved for what I provided, not who I was, told me this story was never just mine. That's the part people don't warn you about either. When you break a pattern, you become a mirror for everyone who hasn't yet, and not everyone likes what they see, but some people desperately need it. If you're watching this and you're angry, confused, validated, or quietly unraveling, that's not accidental. That's your body recognizing a truth your mouth hasn't caught up to yet. And you don't have to act on it today. You don't have to burn bridges or make announcements, but you do have to stop lying to yourself about what something costs you. Love that requires self-erasure isn't love. It's a contract with invisible fine print, and the moment you stop signing it is the moment your life actually begins to feel like it belongs to you. I don't know what your ending looks like. I don't know who will stay or who will go when you stop over-functioning, but I do know this. The peace you get on the other side is quieter, steadier, and more real than anything you lose along the way. And if you're wondering whether choosing yourself is worth the fallout, ask yourself how much fallout you've already survived by not doing it. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you question a dynamic you've been normalizing for years, I want you to say it out loud in the comments. Not for me, for you. Tell me where you're watching from and whether you've ever been the one everyone leaned on but no one protected, because you're not alone in that experience. And the next story waiting for you dives even deeper into what happens when family loyalty collides with self-respect and why walking away doesn't always mean losing. Sometimes it means finally arriving, and you'll want to hear that one next.